At the start of the year, I posed a question. Would 2025 be the make or break year for the Eurovision Song Contest?
What can you tell us about the results?
The long-running show was coming out of its most controversial edition ever, and it needed to make it clear that it was going to change.
In 1956, here in Switzerland, a promise was made to create an international TV show that celebrates music, friendship, and togetherness.
With this promise came a new face to lead the show, and when asked about how he would be navigating the political climate, he repeatedly said that their intention was
to show the world as it could be.
To show the world how it could be.
Show the world how the world could be, not necessarily as it is.
And so, what does that world look like?
This event unites us all, crossing borders, crossing languages, creating a shared space.
Esta no es una petición contra ningún país, es un llamamiento por la paz, la justicia y el respeto a los derechos humanos acorde con la vocación integradora y pacífica del Festival de Eurovisión.
Much like in 2024, Israel's participation was a major source of controversy for the Basel 2025 contest. Leading up to the show, broadcasters in Spain, Ireland, Iceland, Slovenia, and Belgium had raised concerns about allowing Israel to compete while it continues to kill and starve Palestinian civilians. 72 former Eurovision artists put out a letter demanding Israel be excluded, including winners Salvador Sobral and Charlie McGettigan. Separately, last year's winner Nemo had called for Israel to be removed as well. This was after being one of the 10 artists from 2024 who signed a joint statement, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and for the release of all hostages. This year, we saw nothing like that from the competitors, at least not until after the contest. Why they were silent during the competition was probably because of the code of conduct, which prevented them from tying their participation to political causes. Mostly. Even if they had spoken out, last year's contest proved that it would just put a target on your back.
תודה לאולי אלכסנדר ולנבחרת האגרוף המשונה שלו. עקיבא צריך לקבל את זה. יש גם תומכי חמאס שיודעים לשיר, מה לעשות? מה לעשות?
נמו צריך להגיד לא חובב ישראל גדול, היא הייתה שותפה לעצומה נגד ישראל, סתם, שתכירו, שתדעו.
אתם תעשו עם המידע הזה מה שאתן חושבות.
תפי בני ובנות המלא.
תגיד, איזה סטריאוטיפ אתה חושב שהאירים מעדיפים? שהם סטניסטים פלואידים מינית או כמו פעם פשוט שיכורים אלימים?
Moments like the opening ceremony clearly showed that the friction was still there. Of course, in the actual show, they did what they could to convince you that it wasn't.
The very first Eurovision Song Contest was born, created to unite Europe through music. This show was created to unite the world through music.
United by music.
United by music! United by music.
When it wasn't repeatedly sounding off its slogan with no sense of irony, a lot of the show just felt stiff.
I really wish everyone could stay.
Me too, but we still have a few chances to make people happy. And if you paid attention to me 20 minutes ago, you know what that means. Do you have any hidden talents?
I know how to juggle, Kevin is a great cook, and Axel can grow a mustache, so that's...
You know what I call your mustache? A sweat stop dripping device. Okay, I'm gonna check out someone else now.
In fact, just about every moment between the actual performances felt like bad pantomime.
It all started in the mid-50s. In the mid-50s of the 13th century, when this ancient land was in desperate need of a hero who'd unite them all.
What are you talking about?
The thing.
Which thing?
You know, the thing.
Okay.
Spread your wings and dance, little birds.
But of all of the bizarre moments of this year's contest, this is the one that has stuck with me the most. Doesn't matter if you're good or brutal. Well, unless you're Russia. Then in that case, being neutral goes out the window, because who would want to be neutral about Ukraine's freedom? Now, last year had an interval act with a similar joke.
They learned that the Eurovision is cool and non-political, of course.
That one honestly made me laugh. It felt self-aware and like a dig at the EBU or just, the circumstances around that year's contest. This one made me feel like I was watching Eurovision from the bizarro world. And look, you can spare me the usual internet quips like, oh, it's not that deep. I understand that whoever wrote this was probably not trying to make it come off that way, but the reality is Eurovision hasn't shown any compassion for the victims of Israel's violence, and they prevented anyone else from showing compassion either. This is Eurovision's world as it could be, apparently. They go on and on about peace and unity, and then playfully remind people that they don't care if their members are wiping ethnic groups off the face of the planet. And if you find that disturbing, you're shit out of luck, because the organizers made it clear that criticism is not welcome. We, of course, remember this moment from 2024, where a cardinal sin of television was committed, and the illusion of unity was completely shattered.
To make sure the jury voting has gone according to plan, let's check in with the man in control.
The Eurovision Executive Supervisor, Martin Österdahl. What can you tell us about the result?
Yeah, good evening. So the moment of truth has arrived.
In Basel, the scrutineers were kept in an enclosed room, away from the uncontrollable audience. When he was questioned about this, Martin Green claimed that this was because the arena was smaller and they didn't want to take away space for the audience. But that doesn't explain why Martin Österdahl didn't speak at all. And unless you were worried about leaving space open to be booed again, nothing was preventing him from giving his usual spiel to the camera. During the performances, the audio mix was kept on lockdown. Real crowd reactions were barely heard and were largely supplemented by fake applause. None of the energy from the audience was felt by the people at home, and we didn't get any of these memorable moments.
There's no going back!
Now, none of this is new behavior for Eurovision's producers, because we've seen this done in contests in the past. But you do eventually reach a point of diminishing returns when you're so insecure about how the audience might genuinely react that you're willing to drain life out of a television show. The artists were kept on a short string as well. Listen to how many of them were cut off when ending their performance. And this fear of criticism didn't just affect the broadcast, it also affected members of the press. Before the contest, a number of people who had been previously successful in getting press accreditation to be on-site or in the online press center were denied for the first time. Now, when it comes to accreditation, anyone who's applied in the past knows that it's never guaranteed and it's not owed to you either. They always emphasize that the amount of on-site accreditations depends on the capacity of the venue, which is different from year to year. However, when you are rejected, their claim is that they give priority to people with the highest reach and the most original content. That is the reasoning that they gave after rejecting one of the most high-profile creators of this moment.
Imagine a Eurovision where everything that could go wrong goes wrong.
ESC Gabe has a huge audience on YouTube. His videos pull in hundreds of thousands of views, and he's one of the few fan creators that have been called up by mainstream media to provide insights on the contest. Why was he rejected? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that he is one of the most vocal critics of both Israel and Azerbaijan's participation. In 2024, he made a dedicated video before that contest about how both countries have used Eurovision to further their government's agenda. He was also part of a cohort of journalists who pressured the EBU last year when they were keeping everyone in the dark about Joost Klein's absence from rehearsals. Claiming his reach wasn't big enough to be accredited was clearly a lie, especially since everyone can see how many other creators with a fraction of his audience were given that privilege instead of him. Another journalist who was denied press credentials was Simon Stelmazik, who you might remember asked this question to Israel's artist at last year's press conference.
Have you ever thought that by being here, you bring risk and danger for other participants and public?
You don't have to answer that question if you don't want to.
Why not?
If you want to answer.
Simon has been reporting on the contest for 20 years and was given the exact same reasoning as Gabe for being rejected. When speaking to SVT News, he said he believed it is about some form of revenge and, in practice, a restriction of freedom of expression. Now, as I've mentioned, the code of conduct was emphasized a lot this year, and it applied to everyone who had accreditation: artists, delegations, crew members, journalists, volunteers, so on and so forth. One of the things that was stressed was that if you were accredited, you had to agree to protect the integrity of the contest. Now, I remember reading that and thinking, surely that doesn't apply to journalists, because that is simply not their job. They report on the event as it is, whether it's a glowing success or a shit show. But apparently, it did apply to them, because in the media handbook, it says that you are not allowed to publish content that is damaging to the image and reputation of the ESC and the EBU. Tobbe Ek from Swedish tabloid Aftonbladet tried to confront Martin Green about this. He refused to comment on any individual examples of people being declined accreditation and claimed that the language in the media handbook was a desire for people to be kind. When SVT asked about this, he had a different answer. He claimed that the wording was a mistake, saying, "We went too far here. We wholeheartedly support freedom of speech, and we will reword this section next year." When Tobbe reported on this, he went as far as accusing the EBU of silencing journalists and calling their demands sick. And that might sound a bit excessive to some people, but here's what I want you to understand. This is a union of public service broadcasters, all of whom have some form of news media. They're acting like this was just an oversight, and if we were just talking about the language being overreaching, that would be one thing. But the reality is, they put that language into practice. Hardworking journalists and creators had privileges taken away from them, and it seems to be because they're trying to hold the contest to account. That is not an oversight. That's undemocratic.
We've invented democracy and the voting system too.
As far as it being sick, that's not necessarily how I would put it, and I mean, that might be something that's getting lost in translation between Swedish and English, but there is something that is pretty sick to me, and it's not about who was rejected, but who is approved. These anti-Semitic asses in the audience deserve the exact same fate of the 1,300 plus Israelis on the 7th of October. Ugly people, beautiful Golan Eden. May their wives, daughters, men, and sons have the same fate as the 1,400 innocent souls on the 7th of October. Eric Sada official is supporting raping women, burning babies, and slaughtering partygoers, as long as they are Jews. His raised hand is full of blood. Israelis, Jews, don't vote for these anti-Semitic/Jew haters tonight, especially not for Belgium, after what VRT1 did. These posts from 2024 came from a journalist who works for Walla Entertainment, which is owned by the Jerusalem Post. Here he is again in 2025 in the press center. Apparently, this is considered acceptable conduct by Eurovision standards. If it wasn't, he was at least given a second chance. Gabe, Simon, and several others were not.
And every single one of you is invited.
Now, this attempt to wipe away any sign of trouble didn't stop some members of the audience from booing, which only happened during some of Israel's performances. Not all of them, and not to the same degree as the previous year. There were a handful of people who tried to demonstrate by bringing in a Palestinian flag. Unlike previous years, where the audience was only allowed to bring in the flags of the participating countries, this year the rules were changed so that any flag that was considered legal under Swiss law was permitted. But once again, security didn't get the memo. Here you can see a member of the audience whose flag was pulled down by another spectator. According to that fan, rather than deal with the other guy, they tried to confiscate his flag, and they only stopped when he started to record them.
Be careful. Palestine is
There were also attempts to disrupt Israel's performance, including a group of people who used whistles during one of the rehearsals. They were eventually taken out of the venue by security. During the grand final, there was an attempt at a stage invasion. A real one, not the fake one from Estonia's performance that several media outlets treated as real for clickbait. Now, that kind of situation is a security threat, one that the production team has been slow to stop on more than one occasion, and so that person needs to be restrained and escorted from the venue, regardless of whether or not they have violent intentions. But again, security took things even further.
The most loving and the most international family in the world.
Now, all of these actions come at a cost. On the one hand, they challenge the people in charge and, in some cases, expose them. But for the most part, it becomes fuel for Israel's supporters. Israeli officials love to describe people protesting as haters, because that trivializes their motives. Rather than opposing Eurovision's hypocrisy or Israel's extensively documented human rights violations, they're just booing in their eyes because they hate Jewish people. Never mind that in 2024, no one booed Luxembourg, even though it was widely known that Tali was of Jewish Israeli descent. And so any attempts from the people who are still attending Eurovision to go and fight this just ends up being part of the theater that surrounds Eurovision and ends up working in Israel's favor. But the criticism isn't just coming from the artists or the audience or the journalists. It also extends to the broadcasters. And when they're the ones that are challenging the EBU, then the cracks really start to show.
Una artista hasta hace poco desconocida que fue herida en los atentados de Hamas del 7 de octubre. Su canción se titula New Day Will Rise.
Este año Radio Televisión Española ha solicitado a Eurovisión un debate sobre la participación de Israel en el festival. Las víctimas de los ataques israelíes en Gaza superan ya las 50.000 y entre ellas más de 15.000 niños y niñas según Naciones Unidas.
Esta no es una petición contra ningún país, es un llamamiento por la paz, la justicia y el respeto a los derechos humanos acorde con la vocación integradora y pacífica del Festival de Eurovisión.
This was how the Spanish commentators introduced Israel's performance in the second semifinal. In response, Israel's broadcaster Khan filed a complaint with the EBU. They then issued a warning to RTVE, demanding that the commentators not mention the victims of Gaza, or else the broadcaster would be fined. While speaking to Spanish newspaper El País, RTVE confirmed that the commentators did this in coordination with the broadcaster. They also pointed out the irony in how the EBU considered calling for respect for human rights and for peace and justice a political statement, but does not consider it a political act for the Israeli delegation to emphasize its candidate's status as a victim of the Hamas attacks of October 7th. Finally, someone says it. If there was ever any real intention on the EBU's part to not allow the contest to be politicized, this would have been addressed. Instead, they're claiming that victim figures have no place in an apolitical entertainment program. And the irony is nowhere to be found. Now, these threats didn't scare the Spanish broadcaster at all. On the night of the grand final, they opened the broadcast with a message that read, "When human rights are at stake, silence is not an option. Peace and justice for Palestine." Weeks later, the president of RTVE defended their actions as being consistent with their mandate. He also said something that far too many people at his level have yet to say.
Creo que no se puede vivir de espaldas a la realidad y pensar que el Festival de Eurovisión no tiene una dimensión política o no tiene una dimensión en la que afecta de manera muy importante la actualidad que sucede a nuestro alrededor, pues es o ver o no haber visto el festival nunca, porque siempre ha tenido esa dimensión política. Yo quiero decirle que a pesar de las críticas que hemos recibido durante estas 2 semanas desde la celebración del festival, lo volveríamos a hacer igual porque creemos que esto no es una cuestión política, ni siquiera es una cuestión de humanidad, y creo que en las cuestiones de humanidad debemos tener un consenso.
RTVE has had its share of criticisms for how it handles Eurovision and Benidorm Fest, but for this they deserve nothing but respect, because they're demonstrating how to act responsibly as a public service. You don't just blindly follow rules that convenience certain parties. You guide your decisions by principles, and the most basic principle of all in every circumstance is humanity. And they aren't the only ones. Throughout Eurovision week, VRT in Belgium had promoted a campaign with Oxfam called Speak Up for Palestine. The Finnish commentator had also contextualized Israel's participation with respect to the violence in Gaza. But these are still isolated instances. The full context is not being represented broadly enough. And when we consider what the outcome was of this year's scoring, that's exactly how Israel wants it to be.
The audience have awarded you 297 points!
For the second year in a row, the Israeli government funded an aggressive ad campaign instructing people to vote for Israel up to 20 times. Just as in 2024, it also used state-owned social media accounts to push for votes. Now, the impressions of last year's campaign is that it was more selective in terms of which countries they went after, and as a result, they got second with the public vote. This year, they came first, and we can now see that they went after every single country in the contest.
Hola a todos, bonjour à tous, hello zusammen, hi elesam, hej Sverige, hi atlir saman, hallo allemal, witajcie wszyscy, mojka, pochczuń, salami, përshëndetje të qiva.
Now, unlike last year, this time it actually made the news, and interestingly, that includes Eurovision's own fact-checking service, which is a separate entity from the song contest under the Eurovision umbrella. Now, because this has attracted a lot more attention than it did last year, I think it's important to clear up a few things that muddy the conversation around this and get to the root of the problem. Firstly, Israel was not the only country to have a targeted campaign.
Yasu Greece, hola España, ciao Italia, hello Poland, hello Sweden, hello Ireland, hello Germany.
According to Eurovision News Spotlight, Malta, Greece, Albania, Poland, Armenia, and France were all reported to have made sponsored ads. Secondly, the existence of ads is not the problem. The problem is that in Israel's case, their campaign is funded by the Israeli government advertising agency. This is a crucial detail because the EBU's main defense for keeping Israel in the contest while it continues to face accusations of genocide is that the contest happens between public service broadcasters, not governments. It also further emphasizes just how important Eurovision is to the country's image. No government would spend the money needed to get their ads seen tens of millions of times in 40 different countries if there wasn't an important goal. And to understand what that goal is, all you have to do is look at the headlines the day after. As with last year, dozens of media outlets interpreted the score as widespread support for Israel. The Jerusalem Post claimed that Israel is big in Europe. They elaborated by saying, "The message is crystal clear. While the elite staff of the public broadcasters may despise Israel, audiences around the world either enjoyed the song, were touched by Raphael's story of survival, or both." The Jewish Chronicle claimed that the silent majority showed up to demonstrate their love for the song. They also, for some reason, call the score the highest in the history of the contest, which is just completely false, even if we're just talking about Israel's record in the contest. Now, every year, you can find some sort of correlation between the songs that do well in the contest and how they perform commercially, especially with televote winners. If we look at the 3 contests before 2025, each of the televote winners land in the top 5 most streamed entries from the year that they competed. Despite the criticisms of Ukraine's win in 2022, Stefania has the 5th most streams of all the songs from that year. Cha 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 from Finland has the 3rd most streams from 2023. And Rim Tim Tagidim from Croatia has the 5th most streams from 2024. This correlation has also been true for Israel, before they started astroturfing their results. Their winning song from 2018 is the #1 most streamed song. Their 2023 song, which finished in 3rd place at Eurovision, is the 6th most streamed song of that year. If there is a discrepancy, it's with songs that didn't do well in the contest, but then get a second life on streaming, as was the case with Snap in 2022, and what seems to be happening right now with Deslakadu from this year. But just as in 2024, this alleged widespread support for Israel's song is nowhere to be found outside of the Eurovision score. New Day Will Rise is outranked by several songs that finished lower in the results. The host country Switzerland got 0 points from the public, and even their song is doing better than Israel's. But as long as you can push forward the idea that people are voting en masse for Israel despite the political backlash, mission accomplished. People's memories are short, and so even though the New York Times reported on the astroturfing campaign a week later, that story will get much less traction because the majority of the public have moved on with their lives. Now there's another layer to this that wasn't addressed last year. They tell you in the show that you can vote up to 20 times. But as the folks at ESC Insight discovered, it is incredibly easy to vote more than that. In the grand final, they had 2 people cast 160 votes using 8 credit cards. They did this from the same device without the use of a VPN and without changing emails either. And so knowing this, it should be no surprise that when we look at the voting numbers, they don't really correspond to viewership. In 2022, an estimated average of 6.8 million people in Spain watched the grand final, and about 80,000 votes were cast. This is the same grand final where Ukraine swept the public vote, getting 28 sets of 12 points from across Europe, including from Spain. In 2024, viewership was down to 4.9 million, and yet the number of votes nearly doubled to 153,000. Spain's 12 points went to Israel. When looking only at the broadcasts in 2025, the first semifinal had an audience of 1.4 million viewers and over 14,000 total votes. It's worth noting that Spain only voted in the first semifinal, when Israel was not performing. In the grand final, the audience rose to 5.9 million, which is an increase of about 325%. The votes, on the other hand, increased tenfold, totaling 142,000 votes. Again, their 12 points went to Israel. Now, Spain is part of the Big Five, and it's commonly known that the local audience within an individual country will be bigger if their artist is performing in the grand final. And so what about if a country doesn't qualify? Well, looking at Belgium's ratings, the trend is consistent. Viewership increased in 2023 when Belgium qualified, and it decreased in both 2024 and 2025 when they failed to qualify. Despite this, the number of votes increased dramatically, by 5 times in 2024 and by 8.5 times in 2025. In fact, when we compare the 2023 grand final when Belgium qualified to the 2025 final when they didn't, that's where the biggest discrepancies appear. In 2025, there were almost twice as many votes when compared to 2023, even though the viewership is down by 42%. Now, it's difficult to say whether or not the problem runs deeper than simply the flaws of the voting platform. Some people seem to think that it could, but there really isn't any concrete evidence to point to any further manipulation other than this weak security. There were some allegations from last year about the Israeli government setting up voting camps in various countries. If true, that could only be considered direct manipulation by the government, even more so than just the astroturfing campaign alone. But we only have social media posts like this one to go off of, which is not strong enough evidence to say that it's actually true. Regardless, there's a pretty strong feeling amongst the broadcasters that the results did not reflect the opinion of the viewing public, and so many of them have supported the calls from Spain and Belgium to have an audit of the voting system to get more details about how the voting actually played out. Of course, no matter how big and robust the astroturfing campaign was, it doesn't change the fact that people did vote for the song genuinely. Unfortunately, those votes can't be disassociated from people like Gert, who said, "I never watch the song festival, but I always vote for Israel afterwards." Or Michel, who retweeted a post from the Israeli embassy in Spain and then said, "To watch Eurovision is not necessary. Voting for Israel is a moral duty." Or Esther Munoz from the right-wing People's Party of Spain, who said, "Another year that I will vote for Israel without having heard the song." There were also people who voted out of spite for their broadcaster, like MJ, who prefaced his 20 votes for Israel by calling the Irish broadcaster Jew haters. Or Juan, whose votes for Israel were motivated by his desire for RTVE to be shut down. And then there were those who voted out of plain Islamophobia, like Jules, who said, "Personally, I'd rather listen to someone disemboweling a halal butcher than vote in Eurovision, but tonight I shall make the effort." Okay. It is really hard to think of anything that's happened in Eurovision's history that so clearly undermines the spirit of the contest. And even still, the EBU are acting like nothing can be done about it. In Martin Green's response to the broadcasters demanding clarity on the voting, he points out that the rules do not prohibit participating broadcasters or third parties such as record labels or others from promoting their entries online and elsewhere. But he adds, as long as such promotion does not instrumentalize the contest. Well, I mean, at this point, continuing to deny that that's not the intention of Israel's government is being purposefully obtuse. These videos could have only been made by cooperating with the delegation. Eurovision News Spotlight confirmed that there was no AI used in those videos, which means that Yuval was directly involved, and the delegation volunteered to be a part of the government's propaganda. And the irony of all of this is that they probably could have gotten a good score without this cynical exploiting of the current circumstances. But the reality is, like, we'll never know how those songs actually did, and they're undermining their own success. And with that in mind, I have to ask, like, who is this really good for? Like, is this good for the artists? Because you'd think that, like, they would want their work to speak for themselves, and yet they're agreeing to be exploited like this. And, like, is this good for the Israeli public as well, to have their participation in Eurovision be a tool for their own validation? And people will go with it even if that validation is built on a lie? You know, Ukraine gets a lot of flack for continuing to participate while fending off Russia, a nuclear superpower. And to this day, their last victory is also criticized for being only about politics. And that's something that they're going to have to live with. But one thing that Ukraine can say with confidence is that they never depended on such desperate tactics to get the score that they got.
439 points. We now have a new leader.
The end of this year's contest was considered by many people to be one of the most tense finals ever, with Israel taking the lead and holding on to first place until the last second. Only Austria was able to knock them off the top spot, with the highest score from the jury and the fourth highest from the public. Wasted Love is the kind of winner that the Eurovision audience is now used to. It's vocally demanding, it's visually fleshed out, and it has an obvious queer identity. Because of my partial boycott, I don't comment on the qualities of Israel's songs, so the only thing that I can really say about it is that it wasn't what Wasted Love was. But regardless, it goes down in Eurovision's history books as the 2025 televote winner. It often happens that when the song that finished first in the televote doesn't win the whole contest, Eurovision fans have dubbed them the People's Champion. You could apply that to Israel, but only if you factor out the lack of commercial success, the exploitation of the voting platform, and the help that they got from their government, whose leader is wanted by the International Criminal Court. Now, let's go back to that question from January about whether or not 2025 was the make or break year. Clearly, a number of fans believe that the contest has dodged a bullet thanks to Austria's win. Even Graham Norton seemed to feel that way.
And I think the EBU will be breathing the largest sigh of relief that they're not faced with a Tel Aviv final next year.
But as the announcements for 2026 have started to come out, the future of the contest is not looking good. We are now finally seeing broadcasters say, if Israel stays, we are gone, including Spain. And losing Spain would be devastating because they're one of the 5 largest financial contributors to the contest. It would make it more expensive for everyone who participates, which means that countries that can barely afford the contest now would probably have to withdraw too. Now, because there's so much in limbo right now, my answer to that question initially was that the contest was neither made nor broken. It's sort of a TBD situation. But no matter how hard I try, I just can't seem to forget this moment where, in a throwaway joke, the contest is admitting that some of its members are brutal, and they're cool with it. You see, that brutality has been live streamed for 2 years in excruciating detail. You are either witnessing it or you're choosing to ignore it. Eurovision is choosing to give the country causing that brutality a platform for its own narrative, even as the accusations of genocide are growing, not disappearing. It's choosing to censor, scold, threaten, and deny access to those who are showing the other side of that narrative. It's choosing to focus on what unites us, not what divides us. In other words, it's choosing ignorance. That appears to be Martin Green's world as it could be, a world of ignorance, a world that we already live in. These few seconds were so much more real than the rest of the show, which is overly determined to present Eurovision as a force for good. And to me, that's a sign of a contest that has already broken. It also continues to deny what is becoming more and more clear to the general public, that the contest always has been and always will be deeply political. Going on the record and repeating this nonsense that the governments are not involved when the union is mostly made up of public broadcasters is deliberately misleading. And if you want to see how that applies to Martin Green specifically, here he is in 2025 making that same argument.
Is there any sort of effort to codify a standard by which a country would get kicked out for actions outside of the contest?
The first thing I'd say is to remind everyone, countries don't compete in Eurovision. Public service broadcasters do.
And here he is as the managing director for Liverpool 2023 in an interview at an event called the Global Soft Power Summit.
The opportunity that we've got hosting the Eurovision Song Contest for Ukraine is that we have a platform that 160 million people watch. There is a genuine economic benefit to the staging of Eurovision. It far outweighs the financing you have to put into it. But also I think people realise that there is a platform within it to showcase much more than simply the singer or the act that's going on, and to be able to push people into your country from a tourism point of view or an investment point of view. It is, after all, a massive marketing machine for the host country.
And so, no, I'm not relieved that Austria won. I feel like the most appropriate ending for this non-political, strictly neutral, doesn't matter if you're good or brutal contest would be for the brutal country to win. Not because they deserve it, but because Eurovision deserves it. And in that world, maybe people would be honest about what they're willing to ignore for this fake image of peace.